Let's start the CSS grid part of the course by taking a look at what CSS grids actually are, how they work, and why we need them. So, what are these CSS grids that everyone talks about so much these days? Well, the CSS grid layout is a brand new module that brings a two-dimensional grid system to CSS for the very first time. And there really has never been anything like this before in CSS. So this is a real game changer, because it changes everything: how we think about layouts, how we write our CSS, and even how we write our markup in HTML. All of that is much easier and more logical too with CSS grids. And so we can now finally design much more complex layouts, because we now have the tools to actually build them in our code with CSS grid. And that actually also holds true for Flexbox, which works very well together with CSS grids, where Flexbox can handle the one-dimensional layouts and grids the two-dimensional layout parts. Together, these two new technologies solve all the layout problems that we could never really solve before, at least not in a clean and straightforward way. So, by having native grids now right in our browser, we can even throw CSS frameworks like Bootstrap out the window, because CSS is now the framework itself. We don't need to be bound by a simple and boring 12-column layout anymore, like Bootstrap and all these other frameworks. We're free to do whatever we want, because it's now so simple to implement without any weird hacks in our CSS or even HTML code. So building a simple two-dimensional layout like this one, which we're actually going to build in our grid project by the way, becomes really simple and straightforward with CSS grids. It all just works a bit different than the way we've been doing it for so long now with float layouts and other hacks. And that's why I say that CSS grid requires a whole new mindset, a whole new way of thinking about design, HTML and CSS. These are really exciting times to be a CSS developer, and I can't wait to show you how grids actually work. But before we can jump into the code, we need to talk a bit about the terminology around CSS grids. And this is a bit similar to the Flexbox terminology, but actually a lot more complex at the same time. So, just like we have a Flex container in Flexbox, in CSS grids we have a grid container. And we create a new grid container by setting the display property of an element to grid. Simple as that. Then, all the direct children of the grid container are the grid items. We also have axes, like in Flexbox, with the difference that these are called the row axis in the x direction and the column axis in the y direction. And these axes are always the same. We cannot change where they are like we do with Flexbox, which makes it a bit simpler actually. So, row axis and column axis. But there's actually a lot more we need to know. So first, the vertical and horizontal lines that divide up the grid and separate the columns and the rows are called the grid lines. And they are automatically numbered for the columns as well as for the rows, starting from 1 all the way to the number of rows plus 1, and the number of columns plus 1 of course. Now the actual space that is between the rows and columns is called the gutter, and the row gutter can be different from the column gutter. So what are the grid rows and columns actually? Well, the space between two grid lines is called a track, no matter if it's vertical or horizontal. If it's horizontal, then it's called a row of course, and if it's vertical, then it's called a column. Simple as that. But it gets better, because there is more. So the area between two vertical and two horizontal grid lines is called a grid area. And if that area is between two adjacent grid lines and two adjacent column lines, then that area is just called a grid cell. Okay, so I know that this is a lot to take in, so don't worry all too much about it at this point. Because with time, this will all come naturally to you, especially the grid lines, gutters, tracks, rows, and columns. Because we actually use these terms all the time when we start working with grids. And now just to finish this lecture, this is just a quick overview of all the CSS grid related properties for both the grid container and the grid items. Now I will not go into explaining all of these properties at this point, because we're going to use them throughout the rest of the grid part of this course. And so you will certainly get familiar with all of them. So again, this is more intended like a reference that maybe you can even print out, like I actually did, because believe me, this comes in very handy when we first start using grids. So whenever you need to get a quick overview of all these grid properties, here they are. Alright, So that's the quick intro to what CSS grids are. Now let's move on to setting up our tools and finally start coding with CSS grids.